Best. When I saw to the time of my paper, I thought I should speak about the parable of the great dessert, but maybe you still are able with coffee to follow my other approach. Dear colleagues, let me begin with two basic statements. First, the historical Jesus did not tell parables. Second, the remembered Jesus told many parables, in particular kingdom parables. In the following, I will develop these two statements in three steps. First, I will take up the thesis of John P. Meyer's latest volume in his work on the historical Jesus, a volume that is devoted to parables. Second, I will present my own approach to the study of the parables within the context of the memory approach to Jesus. Third and finally, the differences in the two approaches will be examined using the Kingdom of God parables as an example. First, a dead end in historical Jesus research with regard to parables, engaging the work of John P. Meyer. Throughout the various stages of historical Jesus studies, scholars have agreed that parables represent the authentic voice of Jesus. Parables were said to be the bedrock or core of Jesus' speech. Perspectives that supported the view, as Snodgrass puts it, that, quote, the parables are indeed the surest place where we have access to Jesus' teaching, end quote. However, this general consensus in scholarship has now been challenged. According to John P. Meyer in his most recent book, Volume 5 of the Marginal Jew series, maybe you have already seen it, published early this year, had the subtitle Probing the Authenticity of the Parables. According to Meyer, the historical Jesus did not tell parables, or to be more precise, there are only 4 demonstrably authentic parables passed on to us. These happy few, as Meyer calls them, are first the mustard seed, second the evil tenants of the vineyard, third the great supper, and fourth the talent parables. Although Meyer himself stated in volume 2 of A Marginal Jew, quote, the abundance of parables in the synoptic tradition distributed among all the sources, plus the absence of equally deft artistic parables elsewhere in the New Testament, argues well for the origin of many, though not all, of the gospel parables in Jesus' teaching, end quote. In volume 5, he has now challenged this view on the basis of his, in his words, 7 unfashionable theses. I will cite only thesis 7 here. Quote, relatively few of the parables can meet the test of the criteria of authenticity that other sayings and deeds of Jesus are supposed to meet, end quote. Whereas throughout volumes 1 to 4, Meyer asserts that, quote, authenticity could be supported by one or more of the criteria of historicity, in volume 5, such a positive outcome is often not to be had. In most instances, no criterion of historicity can argue convincingly for the origin of a given parable in the mouth of the historical Jesus, end quote. As is well known, Meyer is an advocate of the criteria approach in its purest form. In the just published volume 5 of his work, he repeats the 5 primary criteria which Meyer views as having, quote, proven themselves especially useful. He named criterion of embarrassment, discontinuity, multiple attestation, coherence, and finally the criterion of Jesus' rejection and execution. It is readily apparent that the significant amount of the parable tradition found in the Matthean and Lucan Sondergut fails with regard to the criterion of multiple attestation. More difficult to evaluate is the question concerning embarrassment. For such a query, at its core, contradicts the multiplicity of meaning inherent in the parable genre. As Meyer recognizes, quote, "Needless to say, an ingenious modern critic is free to use his or her skill to interpret a parable in an embarrassing or shocking way. But then the next critic is equally free to offer a different and non-shocking interpretation," end quote. This observation leads Meyer to the following conclusion: no parable fulfills the criterion of embarrassment. With a view towards the criterion of discontinuity, Meyer considers on the one hand the OT and Jewish Meshalem, and on the other the oral tradition of early Christian communities. Here Meyer considers it highly unlikely that, quote, "there was a chain or group of oral traditions who preserved, repeated, and handed down Jesus' authentic parables for 3 or 4 decades," end quote. In similar fashion, Meyer considers the other criteria and finds of all them wanting, resulting in the conclusion that the criteria approach can only lead to a negative result with regard to the parables. In addition to the criteria approach-based examination of the historical authenticity of the parables, Meyer also repeats those embracing reductional critical argumentation. Within the context of his consideration of each of the sources in chapter 39, Meyer argues that the parables are embedded so tightly into their context that it is hardly possible to dissolve original authentic material from it. The example of the parable of the Good Samaritan, one of the best known parables of Jesus, and a parable that is placed second in the list of the 22 authentic parables of Jesus set forth by the Jesus Seminar, serves to highlight that point. Meyer observes the parable of the Good Samaritan is thoroughly Lucan on every imaginable level. The macro structure of Luke Acts, the macro structure of the Great Journey narrative, the characteristically Lucan literary structure of introductory anecdote plus parable, the typically Lucan vocabulary and grammar, and so on. The parable draws on key Lucan theological concerns, such as caring for the marginalized, and perhaps most importantly for Meyer, reflects Luke's unique focus on the Samaritans, which stands in contrast to the, quote, almost total absence of Samaritans in Samaria in Q, Mark, and Matthew, end quote. Therefore, Meyer concludes, when one surveys all of the Lucan elements that make up this literary theological whole, one must ask why any critic could feel an imperative to discover some underlying pre-redactional parable that Luke has rewarded. Even if we suspect some of such substratum, how could we ever discover what it was? End quote. As a result, Meyer arrives at the view that, quote, the parable of the Good Samaritan is a pure creation of Luke the evangelist, end quote. His unflinching application of the criteria employed in historical Jesus scholarship reveals the conclusion to which criteria-based scholarship leads. The criteria approach to the historical Jesus can only achieve minimalistic results, and therefore does not offer a better understanding of early Christian texts, but works against the texts that have been transmitted to us. Stated more pointedly, the criteria approach destroys our sources. It does not interpret them. Meyer himself recognizes that the criteria of embarrassment and of discontinuity cannot be applied to the parables in any meaningful sense. Thus he writes, quote, but this argument from discontinuity does not work with the anonymous traditions of the synoptic oral traditions, especially the parable tradition, end quote. In a similar manner, however, his coupling of redactional criticism with the criteria is equally inapplicable. Is he not completely correct when he asks concerning the parable of the Good Samaritan, even if we suspect some of such substratum, how could we ever discover what it was? Absolutely right. One cannot discover a substratum. And yet Meyer, in my estimation, does not draw the necessary consequence. It is not the parables, but the criteria approach itself that must be fundamentally questioned. The pursuit of authentic Jesus material arrives at its limits and runs into the proverbial brick wall with the parables. Thus, with his work on the parables, Meyer demonstrates once more the demise of authenticity along the lines of criteria-based research. As Chris Keys put it, criteria of authenticity is a problematic concept. Those of us embracing and working with the memory approach to Jesus should be particularly grateful to Meyer for his contribution, which is indeed helpful, even if it may be in a manner quite different from what he intended. Second, parables of remembered Jesus. My second statement at the outset of this paper was that remembered Jesus told many parables. And many means, according to our Compendium der Gleichnisse Jesu, more than 100 parables, which are remembered as having been told by Jesus. In other words, Jesus was remembered as a parable teller. Independently of actual numbers, it is more significant that the fundamental perspective upon and understanding of the transmitted parable change within the memory approach. Before returning to the parables, it is important to make a few foundational observations concerning memory studies in general. Even though there are an increasing number of exegetes positively inclined towards the memory approach, it remains the case that relatively few take the medial side of this process into account. Ellen might be the exception. According to Jan and Aleida Assmann and others, memory always needs media and form in order to be constructed, conserved, and communicated. Various forms such as diaries, photos, gravestones are used by individuals to remember biographical personal events. Thus, several forms of collective memory are also used by different groups, and each group generates special forms which can be regarded as typical for a certain memory, which help to construct the identity of that group. Regarding Christian communities, there are also several forms through which the life and death of Jesus is remembered. For example, liturgy or mimetic ethos, behavior. Most accessible and available for us, however, is language-based memory, that is to say, text. So 2.1, genre as media of collective memories. One of my own research interests within the Jesus memory approach is to consider, in particular, genres as media of collective memories. My own hypothesis, which I have discussed in further detail elsewhere, is that memory requires the repetition and typification of certain forms in order to gain collective meaning. The process of remembering thus inevitably leads to the development of certain forms and genres. Although Tobias Hägglund deeply misunderstood Chris Keith, as we have learned from his most recent article, there remains a deep suspicion against the criteria's approach indebtedness to form criticism. We have already heard about this conflict. For me, in contrast, the memory approach and form criticism can and should be closely linked together. Every cultural community possesses a basic inventory of conventionalized form by means of which the past can take shape and become an object of cultural memory. The form is not reinvented over and over again. Instead, it exists within a tradition that requires and adopts it. Modifying one of Assmann's terms, Astrid Erl and Claudia Seibel have spoken of Wiedergebrauchsformen, forms of reuse, that prefigure cultural memory. Genres, in my concern, can be defined as such forms of reuse, in which a genre can be described as conventionalized form of a text. The past is primarily communicated through narratives, and as a result, a narrated story in the main form is remembering history. This basic statement is only of little help if we want to focus especially upon the details of the process of remembering in early Christianity. Telling a story can be done in various ways, using different techniques, styles, and plots. Hayden White distinguished between 4 basic plots: romance, tragedy, comedy, and satire, by means of which the past is narrated and remembered. He called this implotment. In other words, White assumes a form-finding process as an important stage in remembering the past. I would like to pick up on this view and take it a step further. Narration, or more generally, language-based treatments of the past, cannot be limited to 4 general plots. As a consequence, one must look at the individual linguistic form and genre used in early Christianity in order to remember the Jesus story. It makes a difference in which form certain topics or events of the past are remembered. And this is true not only on the level of macro genre, but also on the level of micro genre, for example, diatribe and komyon, and so on, miracle stories. Furthermore, in the memory process of early Christians, well-known linguistic forms such as wisdom sayings, mishalim, shreya, were not only used, they were also reshaped and reinvented in the collective memory process. Linguistic form, however, are in no way empty vehicles of memory without content. As form-giving entities, they have a definite impact on the process of memory of any culture themselves. In the genre of historiography, Hayden White named this meaning-giving characteristic of form the, quote, content of the form. Ansgar Nünning speaks of a literary critical perspective of Semantisierung der literarischen Form, semanticization of literary forms, maybe a translation. The linguistic portrayal processes and structures thus act as independent bearers of meaning and play a central role in the granting of meaning in memory process. In this way, examining the New Testament genre gives us access to the process of remembering in early Christianity. At this point, the question poses itself: what does this mean with a view towards the parables? So two parables as one extraordinary medium of remembering Jesus. In my view, the parable genre is one of the vitally important genres of early Christianity, which has been shaped and reshaped in telling and remembering this Jesus story. It is striking that though there are some meshalim in the Hebrew Bible, the number is quite limited. It is in early Christianity that parables experience an unpredictable boom. What was this course of the development and sudden valuating of this form? A simple solution would be Jesus told parables. According to Dunn, quote, Jesus was evidently remembered as using parables, end quote. Carrying this command a bit further, one could say that Jesus' manner of speaking left an impact which initiated a particular effect. At the same time, however, the form of the parable is particularly suited for remembering. It is not only narratives that are a preferred medium for remembering the past. Images are also valued as a wonderful tool for aiding memory, and not only in ancient rhetoric, as Samuel Bilsberg has remembered us this morning. Parables are, in a nutshell, a combination of brief narration and imagery metaphors. Thus, we can conclude that parables as metaphorical narratives are much easier to memorize than other texts. This may be true during both the first oral stage of early Christian memory, as well as in the fixation and literalization of memory. The parables, however, are also preferred theological medium for remembering that is closely connected with the proclamation of Jesus. The proximity and presence of the reign of God is set forth in the language of the parables. The kingdom of God is communicated through everyday images and experiences. That which is experience of daily life, the preparation of dough, the loss of a sheep, the work in the vineyard serves to bring theological insights to expression. Jesus approaches people within the concrete world of their experiences and with scenes drawn from everyday life opens their eyes for God's reality. Furthermore, in parables one can learn what does it mean, the forms of reuse or the semanticization of the form. Memory does not utilize arbitrarily determined forms. Rather, it forms and shapes itself to a certain extent through these forms. This point can be made more concrete in two ways: the proximity to daily life as well as the openness to multiple interpretation not only makes variation in the process of repetition in individual remembrance possible, but actually encourage this. Parables drink deeply at the well of the everyday. They are brought into new communicative situation through adapting to the changed situation of daily life. The inherent multiplicity of interpretive meaning due to the parable's metaphorical elements and appeal structure can already be seen within the New Testament itself, and also set new interpretive possibilities into motion. Whoever embraced or has been infused with the form of the parable will, in the process of remembering and retelling, rightly carry out adaptations and assimilations. He or she will not simply recount a parable, but also retell and represent it in a new and different way. Even Birger Gerhardsson maintains that, quote, early Christianity felt itself entitled to formulate new narrative, meshalim, of the kingdom. Meshalim created in the spirit of the master and according to the same lines as his own meshalim. End quote. Such creativity is pejoratively labeled as inflation of parables by Meyer. Without comment. Yet, the semanticization of the form can also be taken up in a different direction. One particular distinctive feature of the memory culture is that the parable texts were always linked to Jesus as the parable teller. By involving the narrative framework of memory, the recounter of the narrative himself becomes an important contextual component of the parables. The evangelists are even able to record in a nutshell that Jesus' entire ministry has been remembered in the form of parable, according to Mark 4:33 or John 16:25. Similar to other instances in the Judeo-Christian tradition, memory of a particular person occurs by means of a specific genre. David was remembered as a writer of psalms, Solomon as a writer of wisdom sayings, Paul as a writer of letters. And therefore, the parables are linked to Jesus as the parable teller. Jesus is the parable teller par excellence. This is not the historical Jesus, but rather the remembered Jesus, or more concretely, the Jesus who is remembered as parable teller. Because of the semanticization of the literary forms, it is this form of the parable had also a meaning-bearing aspect on remembering Jesus. In other words, that supports the creation of a certain Jesus portrait. Because Jesus is remembered as the teller of parable, a specific Jesus portrait is simultaneously observed and created. As Eberhard Jüngel puts it, the basileia is expressed in the parables as parables. This statement can be intensified Christologically, that Jesus remembered as parable teller himself becomes the parable. The parable teller is the parable of God. And in fact, we find this idea, image of God, in 2 Corinthians or in John 1, who reveals the Father. Thirdly, the kingdom of God parables as a test case. In this third section, I begin with a statement arising from the above two sections with specific reference to the kingdom of God parables. Only the Remember Jesus told kingdom of God parables. Following the vast majority of New Testament scholars, one can point out that the preferred theological subject of Jesus' parables is the kingdom of God. A position that has been almost universally argued since the work of Charles Harold Dodd up to, if I'm right, Jens Schröter yesterday within his basic story. Historical Jesus research, however, is not able to prove the veracity of this statement. Instead, the oldest sources, Q and Mark, in general, do not introduce their parables with the formula, the kingdom of God is like. And the kingdom of God explicitly appears only twice in Q and twice in Mark. That is in Q13, parable of the mustard seed and leaven, and in Mark 4, the parable of the mustard seed once again, and in 4:30, parable of the growing seed. The parable of the mustard seed appears in both sources, therefore there are only 3 parables in Mark and Q which explicitly relate something about the kingdom of God. This is even more remarkable when considering the wide range and large number of parables actually found in these sources, as identified in our compendium. Out of a total of 28 Q parables and 17 Markan parables, the kingdom of God is referred to only 30 times. That is a total of 45 parables within the oldest sources, and we find only 3 kingdom of God parables. What makes this reality even more striking is that despite of this paucity of kingdom parables, both sources speak quite often of the kingdom of God. 17 occurrences in Q, and this telegumenon is at central points in Mark as well, Mark 1:15. It was only the first evangelist who brought together 2 otherwise parallel currents of memory. On the one hand, the memory of Jesus' parable discourse. On the other hand, the memory of the constitutive meaning of the kingdom of God in Jesus' proclamation. In parable introduction in Matthew, the kingdom of heaven is employed 10 times as a regular frame of reference for the parables. According to Dunn, Matthew's much more extensive use of the motive may indicate the technique of the storyteller retelling the parables as much as Jesus' own characteristic style. End quote. One can agree with Dunn's judgment within the scope of Matthean remembrance. Jesus was evidently remembered as using parables to illustrate or illume what he had in mind when he spoke of the kingdom. End quote. In this way, creative memory is shown to be established in the object itself. The form of the parable is considered to be constitutive for Jesus' speech of the kingdom of God. In addition to the Jewish theological tradition, it is the concrete world in which humanity lives on a daily life basis that becomes the canvas upon which Jesus paints a theological message of the reign of God. This proximity to life and people is the deepest expression, according to Matthew, of Emmanuel in Matthew 1:23, which proximity to the world is promised at the end of the age, Matthew 28. To sum up, the example of the kingdom of God parables thus reveals that approaching the text on the basis of the traditional criteria of authenticity has a destructive element that ultimately destroys our sources and their content. The memory approach, by contrast, interprets the extant traditions and brings them into contact with each other in a productive manner. Here, parables are a medium of remembrance that serve as an example to highlight the manner in which the intensification and forming of memory takes place. and to aid us in our understanding of this transmission process. Thank you.